Super excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me here today.
No, thanks to you, Jared. Thanks for having us. Yeah, we've been listening to your podcast and always very interesting stuff coming on.
Thanks, appreciate it. And it was great being able to meet you in person at Money 2020, my first one, which was awesome. At the end, we'll talk a little bit about what you thought. But right now, would love if you could just give us a quick overview of dLocal to start, and then we'll dig into some cool conversations points.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'll kick it off. So, dLocal, for those of you that don't know it, I like to always summarize it in we do financial movement in emerging markets, right? So, the basis of what we're solving for companies globally is basically allowing them to sell into all these what we call emerging markets, and we can go into detail of which ones those are, right? As if they were present in those markets, right? As if they had a local entity, they were connected to their consumers and so on, right? So if you think about, I don't know, how does, Spotify sell in Africa, right? A subscription because people there pay with mobile money, for example, and not a credit card, they do it through us, right? How does Starlink offer things like satellite internet in 25 plus countries across the world and make sure it's seamless to those consumers is through us. And then that's more on the accepting payment side of the house. And then you have what we call, making payments, right? Which is more around, okay, how do people get paid in all of these markets, right? So if you're, I don't know, a host of Airbnb and you're trying to get paid, because you've rented out your place, then we enable also those routes as well. If you're a contractor, which today, is getting wider and wider across the globe, somebody working remotely, for a company in the US, but they're sitting in, again, the Philippines, Thailand, Nigeria, Egypt, or any of those places, we enable those transactions also for those type of businesses.
If you had to bucket it a little bit in terms of stakeholder, like people that care the most about what you're offering, what are kind of those main buckets?
I think is that, number one, we allow them to get to consumers they would never get to otherwise, right? So, if they wouldn't be using a dLocal type company, they wouldn't really be able to go and sell into these markets, right? So get an operation up and running. So that's the number one thing we're solving for them. We're increasing their customer base, right? Which by default means increasing the revenue, and we allow them to be, through one API and one connection, we allow them to be in plus 40 markets across the world in a single click, right? And that means basically, for I'm from Argentina, for example, right? And then in Argentina, really, if you don't have local cards like Naranja, for example, or you don't have something where you can go and pay in cash in different places, then many times, you don't feel like it's a localized experience and you don't kind of trust the brand, right? You're not sure who you're transacting with. So we give that look and feel for all of these companies, right? And as I said before, we allow them to really break into these markets and really be part of that social concept, right? And that feeling.
Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you here today is when we look at just you kind of already painted a picture of what digital payment would kind of look like, but I would love to talk a little bit about just more so the market opportunity. So we're seeing massive growth in emerging market e-commerce. What are some of the key drivers behind this growth, and what role do you feel payment solutions will play in that?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Like if you look at the general stats across the world and you go, okay, where is, gonna be the biggest growth in terms of population, for example, right? Or where are the most people which, before were completely unbanked coming into, the social play through some of these things that I mentioned before, like, okay, now you can work remotely for a company, right? From anywhere in the world. So I would say those are like the biggest driver, right, is okay, the biggest population growth will be in Africa, right? So in 30 years from now, most of the newborns will come from the African region, for example, right? And those are people that, if you look at some of the stats in the last couple of years, they went through, from having, an income of maybe, $150 a month to grow it to, $800, $1,000, which is a massive increase in those sense, right? So those start to become consumers in what we call the e-commerce space, right? They could either be buying, I don't know, an education course online. They could be buying, a pair of shoes for one of the brands that They could be consuming any type of services that, us, for example, we are based in the US, right? So we are very, very used to having, I don't know, 17, 18 different subscriptions, right? In those places, that doesn't really happen, right? Because many times the tools were not there. So it's a lot of that big play of, okay, number one, internet penetration is growing, right? So, internet penetration in what we call emerging markets grows double digit every year, right? So in many of these markets, it's still 50% of internet penetration, 40%, and it continues to grow. So as internet penetration grows, the availability of those consumers starts to come into the market, right? And with that comes also what I just mentioned is what is the power that they have to consume a lot of these things, right? And that's where we come into play as a company, and some of the trends that we're seeing kind of come together in what we call emerging markets, right? And if you look at Brazil, for example, and there's very successful case about Nubank, which is a digital bank, right? That allow they grown to 100 million users, right? In maybe 3 or 4 years, which is an impressive growth. And why do they achieve that? Because it's such a large country, right? That many people had been unbanked for a very, very, very long time, right? Because they don't have a branch of the bank that they can go into, right? And and open a bank account. Many times they wouldn't even allow them because their income was too low, right? So when you see companies starting to focus in those type of areas, those are 100 million new consumers that can come in and take advantage of a lot of these products and services, right? So I think it's the combination of all those things that are happening, which are making the explosive growth that we see in emerging markets versus what we call, more of the developed markets, which could be, the US, Europe, right? When you look at e-commerce in a lot of these places, the explosive growth happened 15 years ago, right? In many of these cases. And now they grow, but they grow single digit and in a very small way from that perspective. So those are a lot of the components that we're seeing today that kind of are building up the momentum when we talk about emerging markets.
Now, when we talk about like some alternative payment methods, I want to also talk about this. So, can you walk us through some of the most popular alternative payment methods in emerging markets and maybe why they've gained so much traction?
Yeah, no, for sure. So, I'll give you examples. For example, if you go to Africa, right, and different parts of Africa work different. If you go to Africa, you have systems like M-Pesa in Kenya, right, or mobile money in West Africa. Why? Because there's still not a lot of internet connection, right? So people are still using a lot of their mobiles to make these transactions, but we've allowed them to be able to purchase all those products and services through those mobile money or through those telephones that they use, right? And why? Because a lot of the population still remains unbanked, as I was mentioning before, right? So what happens is that creates a very big opportunity for things like digital wallets, right? Mobile first payment solutions. And those are the type of things that we see. If you move, for example, to Asia, right, which is a very, very developed market, you start to see that digital wallets are the primary, I would say, form of payment, right? In the US, the primary form of payments is credit cards, right? Credit cards is 99% of the market there. But again, if you go to Asia, people are very used to what we call apps or super apps, right? So it's apps where they can basically do everything from order food, right, to pay the healthcare, to pay insurance, their services, order different, what we call retail products. And some of those are, for example, WeChat Pay and Alipay, right? Which you probably heard a lot about, which are based out of China, or Gcash in Indonesia, for example. Those are things where absolutely every single transaction that's coming in is coming from those payment methods, right? And when you look at the share of credit cards, it's very, very small, right? In some of these places, it's single digit. In some others, it could be 10, 15% of all the transactions that we see across our platform from that standpoint. If you go to India, for example, what's called UPI, which is the Unified Payment System, right, that has been created and pushed through the government and many other regulators there, that has taken over the entire market, right? So everybody that's doing a transaction there is doing it through UPI specifically, right? Brazil is another great example. So in Brazil, for example, a couple of years ago, credit card was maybe 50% of the market, right? Then there was a very big payment method, which is cash oriented, called Boleto Bancario. Then came in the Central Bank of Brazil, right, and created something called PIX, right, which is directly tied to your ID locally. Now, that allowed for a lot of people that before couldn't really make a transaction to start making transactions, right? So PIX is basically an instant payment system created by the central bank, in which they basically made every single financial institution in Brazil to adopt them, right? It wasn't, a question of, okay, could we adopt it or could we not adopt it? No, everybody had to take on it, right? And I think those are the success cases we're seeing. And today, you go into Brazil, you want to buy a juice in the street, which could be cost, I don't know, 50 cents of a dollar. They're going to offer to pay for you to pay with PIX, right? And everybody has a PIX key. It's, every single business today, from the Facebooks of the world, Netflix and so on, they now accept PIX as well, right? And we've seen a massive change there for, that 50% that was, credit cards, plus the other percent that was cash has moved a lot into what this instant payment system called PIX, right? So those are some of the things that we see. And, when you look at why have those been so successful, because there's other cases where some of these instant payment methods, for example, have not been that successful, is because when central banks, regulators, and governments really have a play in this and enabling this payment system, it changes completely the game, right? And that automatically gives value to everybody in the chain, right? Why? Because I don't know, you as a somebody who's selling a service or a product, then it's way cheaper than a credit card, for example, right? Number one, you get your funds right away, so you don't have to wait time. In many places like Argentina, unless they will be players like us, you could get paid in, I don't know, 20 days from when you charge that transaction, right? So those are the type of things that I think we're seeing that are kind of changing the game at a global scale.
Now, let's talk. Let's kind of shift focus to dLocal now. I know you've already mentioned parts. You've included that with some of your responses, but could you, like, when we look at maybe the main technical and operational challenge in building payment infrastructure across diverse markets, like what does that look like?
I say number one is, infrastructure gaps, right? Like there's, a lot of inconsistent infrastructure when you look at these emerging markets, right? So there's a lot of disconnect between all of the system, and that's where we come into play, right? To try and simplify all of that for all these global merchants, right? Today, as I said before, if you go to Asia, like people will have maybe 7 to 8 wallets that they're using, right? To just pay for different things. They'll order food in one, they'll do other services in other. If they have, I don't know, loyalty points in another ones or promotion, they'll use that other wallet. So what we do is come and simplify that offering, right? And say like, okay, we'll have them all for you, right? You'll be able to offer all of them in one go. The other thing I'd say is, remember that a lot of these, I would say, emerging markets, when you look at, for example, security concerns, right? There's not so many things as in the US or so many systems that provide that security layer, right? And that's where dLocal comes into play to provide that assurance to a lot of these global merchants that it's easier and it's safe to transact in these businesses. And, we've got it covered in terms of, how are fraud people, behaving, for example, right? What are the fraud trends there? How do you stop it? What is a good consumer from a bad consumer from that standpoint, right? So those are some of the examples. Other is cultural diversity, right? So, all of these countries have very different ways in which people react and act, right? And I think those are some of the things where we come into play to say, okay, here's what you need to know about Nigeria, right? This is how Nigerian people are used to paying. This is what a checkout experience looks okay for them and looks safe for them, right? And many times that's not the same that in the US, right? And the same happens in Argentina. This is what an Argentinian user is used to seeing. This is what somebody in the Philippines is used to seeing as a checkout experience, right? And I think those are some of the factors where we're seeing there that are always make it more difficult in emerging markets, and we try to come in and simplify with that like layer on top, right? And then of course it's around many times we're just pushing the ecosystem, right? Like if you think about subscription businesses like Netflix, right, or a Spotify that we mentioned before, many of these payment methods in these countries were not built to be able to accept recurring or subscription businesses, right? Why? Because as I said before, it still hasn't gotten there, right? They're still not used to it. So what we do is we go and try and build that technology, right? To say, okay, you don't have to worry about this. It will come at some point, right? Build from their end. But so far, we'll take the complexity out of that. We'll build an engine that allows you to do those things as you do it in the US, right? But it could work on a cash payment method, for example, right? Or on a digital wallet or on a bank transfer method. And those are the type of things. And I think in parallel, what we try to do is also push the ecosystem, right? We have as a company, a very big focus on alternative payment methods because, as I said before, when we say alternative payment methods, it's everything that is not credit cards, right? As I said before. So it's a variety of things. And our responsibility as one of the main actors in many of these markets is making sure we push the ecosystem. We tell them like, this is how you would need to develop technology, right? These are the things that, an Uber wants to see in order to be able to give their customers the same experience, whether they're in the US, right? Whether they're in Kenya, whether they're in the Philippines, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, or any part of the world from that standpoint.
Before we wrap up here, too, just I have like just a few more things I wanted to dive in. So, really, closing questions here. What advice would you give to businesses looking to expand into these emerging markets regarding payment strategy? And then part two to that, looking ahead 5 to 10 years, what changes do you expect in this landscape?
Very rapidly adopting new technologies, right? So today they might use, one wallet. Tomorrow a new wallet comes up, and they're gonna adopt it really, really fast, right? And then you go from 0 users on that to 15, 20 million, 50 million, right? So that means that you gotta adapt really, really fast to those changes as well. And that's a lot of what we're seeing, right? We're seeing a shift of people who used to use a lot of credit cards in these places, right? To just having multiple options there to do a payment, right? And really being the consumer, the one that gets to choose, right? It's not anymore the business. The business needs to adapt to that and be really, really on top of their consumers and their preferences, which again change a lot more fast than what they do in the US here, like we do, or in Europe, like others.
Just I want to thank you so much for joining me here today. Really appreciate your time and your thoughts. Look forward to continuing the conversation and having you on again in the near future.